Good afternoon. If you don't remember any of these people being in The Only Way is Essex, then you're in the wrong room, and you should go somewhere else. If you think that only one of them was in The Only Way is Essex, then you'll have a shock next time you pitch something at certain channels. We're going to talk this afternoon. About a subject. It would be ideal in a way if this session had never happened, had been cancelled, if the walkways outside were too wet for you to approach the venue, or if the BBC press office decided there was too much risk of the controller of drama saying something outrageous.
I'm hoping to do it. Sam's there.
Which is unlikely. But we are going to talk about the question of risk in broadcasting. We're not just thinking about scandal and outrage, or indeed about health and safety at the other end. We're going to explore what we mean by risk. We've asked each of the panel to nominate a clip of what they regard as risk in TV, which we'll talk about in a moment. I've chosen 3 or 4 historic clips, which we'll talk about. Do please tweet questions or reactions to the hashtag. Apparently this year, a lot of the questions have been coming by tweet. Speech is still allowed if anyone wants to respond verbally to the session. I thought we'd start with, well, I should introduce the panel, and this is very appropriate. Brian Woods, documentary maker, Dying Rooms, Kids Behind Bars, and you are perfect for this because you suffered an industrial accident at the BBC.
I did.
Tell us what happened.
I don't know if those of you who know the BBC, the Wood Lane reception of TVC has got those big doors that you press the button and they rotate. Well, be really, really careful, because if you press the button and you step just the wrong moment and you're wearing sandals, then you get this.
Don't show the blood.
Oh, and I've actually got a picture.
No.
It's horrible.
So following this accident, action will be taken. The doors won't be there next week, or will they?
I've been told that so many people have been injured by those doors that they actually have, that at one point there were leaflets handed out as to how to use the doors. This was the BBC's health and safety response, was to give you a leaflet, so that therefore it was your fault if your foot got trapped under the door.
Are you suing them?
I wasn't planning on suing them, no. But maybe, maybe. We'll see how the commissions go.
Yeah. Jay Hunt, Chief Creative Officer of Channel 4, former controller of BBC One. David Lidderman, who has held various positions, including controller, Head of Entertainment at BBC One, Director of Programmes, ITV, and is now a BBC trustee.
Yeah.
And Ben Stevenson, Controller of BBC Drama. So let's start to say this word risk that is thrown around. If you could tell me what you think of as risk, and whether you think there's too much in TV at the moment, too little, or in that famous phrase used by senior BBC executives, that they're getting it just about right at the moment. Brian?
Well, I think about risk primarily not in the same sort of terms perhaps as these guys. For me, risk is what Alex Crawford was talking about this morning, or what Lindsay Hilson was doing a few days ago as the bullets were going into the ceiling of her.
Physical risk.
Yeah, the risk I tend to deal with week to week is assessing whether, we've been commissioned to make a film, and how risky is it? Is it worth risking a crew or my own chances of getting arrested or deported from a country, or injured, or life? Yeah, of course. If obviously. Nothing. I often say to directors who are working for us, it's only telly. But of course you take risks. You couldn't make the kind of stuff that we make, investigative and campaigning telly. You couldn't make it without risk. But it's about balancing up those risks. And the problem is you never know you've got it wrong. You never know. Every time you get away with it, you think, okay, you're confident. We made a film last year in Zimbabwe, and we were told by BBC High Risk, that they were the high risk team at the BBC, that they were approving our going into Zimbabwe and making this. But I was told by the guy in charge of the high risk team, we reckon you'll last a week before you're caught and kicked out. In fact, we went back 4 times for 2 weeks on each occasion, and got away with it. But who knows how many of the precautions that we took were necessary and how many of them were actually being overcautious.
And very briefly before we move on, now that you have things such as high-risk teams at the BBC, is it harder to take the kind of risk you're talking about than it used to be?
Yes, it is harder. It's a hell of a lot more paperwork. It's a lot more bureaucracy. And some of that, of course, is really good. You know, you mentioned the dying rooms. When we made the dying rooms, basically, Robin Gutch, who was the commissioning editor at the Channel 4 at the time, said, "Yeah, this sounds good. Tell me how it went." And you know, we wandered off into China and wandered around with secret cameras for a month and came back and said, "We've got some interesting rushes." That doesn't happen now, and that's a good thing. At times, it can feel like a bit of a pain when you're dealing with someone who, when you've made a lot of films like this and you know the risks, and you're dealing with someone who doesn't necessarily know the risks, but thinks they know the risks, and is telling you, no, you can't do that, and you're going, well, I really think we can do that.
Jay Hunt, you can give us a comparison. Having gone from the BBC to Channel 4, are you able to take more risks at Channel 4 than the BBC?
I think it's a sort of different sense of risk. I mean, to me, risk is about doing something that's daring and dangerous and really being prepared to sort of push the boundaries. I mean, to Brian's point, if in a Channel 4 context, that could be as varied as Sri Lanka's killing fields, where we risk, huge amounts of criticism from the regulator, but also, to be blunt, going into work on a Monday morning wondering if we're going to have a brick through the window, or looking at the other end of the spectrum at something like Beauty and the Beast and thinking, is there a way in which you can engage an audience with a difficult subject like facial disfigurement at 8 o'clock in the evening, which is a commercial and an editorial risk. So I think the spectrum's different, and certainly because of the way the BBC's funded, I think you have a different sense of what risk looks like there.
David, you've been on both sides of this because as a regulator, in effect, and also a programme maker and commissioner. So has your attitude towards risk changed as a result of those moves?
No, not at all. I think without risk, we stand still. I think without risk, we have dull and bad television. Every breakthrough that redefines what a genre is a risk. And we don't know we've got it until we've got it. So somebody, somewhere, has got to make a decision to go ahead with something that hitherto people have said wouldn't work. So I think without risk, we're a sort of dead medium.
Ben Stevenson, do you ever turn down a project because it's too risky?
No. Not risky enough. I mean, I think that my job's working with writers. What's riskier than somebody sitting in a room, coming up with an idea, having the courage to put it on a piece of paper, and then going through the extraordinary process of putting it onto the screen? That's one person's imagination being sold to 5-6 million. For me, that's the epitome of risk. I think sometimes the word risk worries me a little bit because I think it can become shorthand for a certain type of tone of things, and that actually it can avoid conversations about risk in the mainstream, at the heart of the schedule. So I actually think the word ambitious is sometimes more useful. I think that BBC One 9 o'clock drama, in all its different forms, even if it's a piece of entertaining drama, should be incredibly ambitious. I would say that ultimately trusting the writers is the most ambitious, risky, exciting thing you can do. It's why I do my job. Hugo Blick came to the office 3 years ago, said, I'd like to write 6, it was then, it turned into 7, hours of a drama that I'm going to direct and produce. We were like, fine, go and do it. Saw him 3 years later, he delivered it, we put it on the screen. That for me is
the shadow line.
The shadow line indeed. That's for me the most exciting thing we can do. Seeing Stephen Moffat there, seeing him delivering, Sherlock on Doctor Who on a daily basis, and writers having that depth and boldness of vision. That for me is what risk is. It's about trusting individuals.
But when you say you would never turn down a project because it was too risky, that can't be true, can it? Because at the BBC, you have a list of guidelines, legal and otherwise, higher than your desk.
Well, last time we did this panel, Mark, you asked me whether we put porn on television, and I wouldn't. So I would turn down porn. But apart from that...
but in other areas, if somebody comes to you with a drama about living members of the royal family or David Cameron, there's a huge set of guidelines.
But I'm not going to
and you must
speculate
refer to
about fictional dramas that haven't been pitched to me. I have never, ever had to turn down a drama at the BBC because someone told me to, or I didn't feel it was the right thing to do. Categorically, it has not been my experience. If you look at a bold piece that Jay and I did, like 5 Daughters last year, big risks involved in that. Morally, we felt it was absolutely the right thing to do, and it was a big success, and we were incredibly supported. So I can't speculate on a fictional circumstance of somebody pitching me something one day.
No, okay, but just
Mark,
to clear that, but you've never not done something
No.
because there was a legal risk, for example, of libel or defamation.
Well, you'll always have, I mean, obviously, if you're making a factual drama, you'll have, I mean, all of us would, making documentary, anything, you would have conversations about the detail of it. That's called being sensitive and honourable, and of course that's the right thing to do, but categorically not a single drama, no.
David?
No, I was going to say that when I was the last year at ITV, I commissioned The Deal, which was the film, the Pete Morgan film about Gordon Brown and Tony Blair for ITV. And 6 months later, the ITV cancelled the film and it went to Channel 4 because ITV were in a state of discussion and negotiation with renewals of their licenses and so on, and felt at the time that to carry a film of that kind, that at the time was going to reveal the truth about that relationship, was a risk to the corporate health of the network. I thought that was a mistake, but I think that's the reason they did it.
We're going to give you examples in a moment. Just one thing I want to ask you, we've got a regulator here, David Lidderman. And you said, Jay, that one of your programmes, you risked a reaction from the regulator. I was thinking about this because I go to football a lot and follow football. Now, a football manager will just think, in the course of this season, we will get a number of red cards and yellow cards, and we just accept that as long as we win and do well enough. They would never think we're going to entirely avoid red and yellow cards. And sometimes at the BBC, I think there are producers who are trying to avoid any risk of red and yellow cards. Do you just accept there will be trouble with the regulator?
Well, yeah, I think there will be trouble. I think Channel 4 is at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of risk-taking, and that's exactly where it should sit, and that's one of the reasons I find this job completely invigorating. We've just announced a comedy drama about the hacking scandal. That's tricky. We're going to transmit this autumn a comic strip with The Hunt for Tony Blair, which portrays a former Prime Minister as a serial killer. I mean, these are all quite out there ideas. And in terms of Sri Lanka, the killing fields, in 10 years working in news, I have never seen footage like that, and it was incredibly close to the line. And we absolutely knew that technically that was in breach of what is acceptable to viewers, but there's a huge sense of moral good and greater good. So I think to a certain extent, if we're not troubling the regulators, we're not trying hard enough.
But you shouldn't fetishise risk as, as a sort of good thing in itself. I mean, what we want is great television. And
yeah, but you've already said, David, that goes hand in hand with risk-taking.
Yeah, no, it does. But it's Mark's point, really, that of course you hope that schedulers and commissioners and producers do whatever is necessary to get great ideas to the public. And of course, there are a whole set of guidelines, and there are some legal issues and so on that are the kind of framework we all have to work within. I think there's a slight danger that you turn kind of risk into a kind of macho, we're going to defy the regulator, or we're going to defy the BBC Trust as a sort of badge of honour, when actually I don't think, I can't speak for Ofcom, but certainly the Trust, we don't sit around trying to catch people out. What you want is as bold and good a television as possible.
I completely agree with David. I think that risk is about being boldly creative, and as David said at the beginning, I don't think there is a single great hit television show that wasn't a big, ambitious risk. Sometimes, as Jay say, they'll be taking on the establishment. Sometimes they'll just be doing things in a strange, different tone. It could just be there to make you laugh, could be there to make you think, but it's about tackling things in fresh and original ways. And genuinely, you will not get standout hits across the field in any genre, in any schedule, without taking risks, ambition, being incredibly ambitious, whatever.
But just very quickly on that, Ben, do you just accept that some of the drama you make, it may get a rap on the knuckles from the BBC Trust? That is just a risk you take.
I don't think about it like that. I just think, how can I deliver the best home for the best writers to do their best drama? Inevitably, that means a huge variety of drama across all of our 4 channels without commercial imperatives. And then I'd have those conversations along the way, but it's not at the forefront of my mind. The forefront of my mind is, how can we be the best place for the very best writers to work?
The first tweet, not about those as before them, has just come in. Krishan Aurora, Ben is right to distinguish risk and ambition. Risk is when you think it might not work. Ambition is about being bold. Now, without getting too much like the X Factor and shouting out names, we'll start with Bleak House. Anyone want to have a guess as to which of the 4 chose Bleak House? Correct. Got it in one.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't you.
No, not guilty.
David.
No, yeah.
It was David.
Yeah.
Why?
Because here was, this wasn't Oliver Twist, it was Bleak House, and it was played as half-hour serials after EastEnders in peak time BBC One. It was the boldest piece of scheduling I think I've seen for many, many years of probably the most exemplary adaptation of Dickens we've seen for decades, plonked bang in the centre of primetime BBC One following EastEnders. I thought it was an inspired idea, a considerable risk that paid off magnificently.
Dickens, though, is the kind of thing that a number of newspapers would say in editorials, it's the kind of thing the BBC ought to be doing. I mean, was it really a risk?
It was in the way it was presented.
But what was the jeopardy?
I mean,
what could have gone wrong?
The last time Bleak House was adapted by the BBC, it played as a BBC Two serial. Right?
Yeah, but that in itself speaks volumes. The fact that it had already been done by the BBC means that the risk is not that great, is it? I mean, I love a good scheduling risk, you know me, but the notion of Dickens as an adaptation is not risky, is it?
I think
anything. I thought that was a. I mean, you may not think that, but we spent a great deal of time when we were reviewing BBC One, challenging the BBC management about the level of risk in the peak time of BBC One, that kind of active disruption of the schedule to introduce texture and variety into the schedule, which we would expect from the BBC, given its particular role in British television. So I think it's a fantastic example.
And again, it's within its own terms, isn't it? If you compare Bleak House to a completely new drama about inner cities or something, of course it's different types of risk. But in terms of adaptation, which is a brilliant part of the TV schedule, that book is a risk because it's quite a dark book, quite hard to adapt. Doing half hours in pre-Watershed after EastEnders, asking the audience to watch it twice a week in the way they've never watched it before. So again, it's about not judging things in next to things that aren't the same as it. No, but in its own terms, I think it's a huge risk. So I also think when you're adapting a brilliant book, it's got to be brilliant. That's hard in TV. You know, that's a risk in itself, making things brilliant. If that was easy, we'd all be doing it all the time.
But if we're going to talk about risk, I understand what you're saying, but there has to be something that could go wrong. There has to be some jeopardy, which would be outcome. That's what the risk would have been.
Yeah, it could have got low. It could have got low rating. It could have been Andrew Davis's idea that he had in bed one morning, and the audience goes, "I don't want to watch this. It's rubbish. I want to watch it at 9 o'clock on Sunday." So that's a risk.
Brian, briefly adjudicate: is Bleak House risky?
I don't think doing Bleak House is risky. I think it was a risky bit of scheduling.
But there are adaptations.
Well,
that
it wasn't just
worked.
the scheduling. It was conceived in half hours to play after EastEnders. It wasn't. So it's misleading to think of it as, well, Bleak House wasn't risky. The whole idea was with it to play it as a soap following a soap.
But it was written as a serial soap, in effect, wasn't it, in magazines? Yeah. So it was going back to its roots.
But it had never been done before in British television like that.
And traditionally, that kind of Dickens serial plays on a Sunday night, and those people we're all professionals in television, know about the demographics of television and who watches television when. By and large, the Dickens viewer are lighter viewers that watch on Sunday evenings and don't watch much sometimes in the other week, and they certainly don't watch television before 9 o'clock at night in the weekdays. So to introduce this kind of drama into the schedules at 8 o'clock at night was a bold thing to do.
I'd also say that, you know, doing adaptation is not a short-fire way to have a success. There's no such thing as a short-fire way to have a success. Okay. There is no such thing as guaranteed success. So to that extent, everything is a risk. So again, the question you have to ask yourself is, how can this be the best in show, the best, most ambitious version of itself? Otherwise, you just never do things like that, or commercial broadcasters would do them all the time, which they don't. Okay, we need to move on. You probably all guessed that it was Brian Woods who chose Pineapple Dance Studios. In fact, it wasn't. It was Jay.
I mean, I chose it slightly tongue-in-cheek because I think one of the alarming things to me about conversations about risk and ambition is they tend to drift naturally towards the very high-end end of the market. And actually, I think sometimes, and Ben and I certainly had this experience on one, is that the hardest things to get right are the things that, frankly, can be written off as a piece of frippery. And I think what's extraordinary about that show, I think Made in Chelsea and The Only Way is Essex owe a bit of a credit to Pineapple Dance Studios. This is a commercial broadcaster doing a show which is combining what feels like an observational documentary with constructed reality, reality in quite an interesting way, develops a piece of talent that you've not seen anywhere before, and manages to marry it rather magnificently with Michael Burke's voiceover, though I think I've heard subsequently he didn't quite realise what he was doing at the time he'd been booked to do the gig. So I'm not saying that's going to be BAFTA award winning, but I think it's just a sort of little gem in television which sets a number of hairs running, which is actually quite an unusual flavour and has actually changed the way in which people would approach that sort of piece of television going forward. And to me, that is a risk. And as it turns out, it didn't rate terribly well for Sky One, but it doesn't. The risk is multi-layered there, a complicated piece to do, new talent, strange genre in a commercial setting.
Any of the other three, do you want to disagree?
I wouldn't categorise it as a very risky programme. It was a pretty low-cost essentially observational documentary. It went in that particular direction.
But it wasn't, no, David. It was an observational documentary married with people breaking out and dancing in quite a constructed way. I mean, it's nothing like it had ever been seen on television before. And as I say, this always worries me about conversations about risk. Everyone's much more comfortable at the end of the spectrum when we talk about The Wire than they are about talking about things that are actually trying to cause
I would say, when I was considering what to suggest, my alternative was going to be Strictly Come Dancing, which I thought was a phenomenal risk that played off spectacularly. I don't accept that risk is just about at the top end of the market. It's across the market. I agree with you. I just don't agree that Pineapple Dance Studio is a particularly good example of risk-taking in British television.
I think where I completely agree with Joe, I have to say, is if you say to people, we want risky, what will that be interpreted as wrongly are things that we should all absolutely make. We made Stolen and Exile this year. They're absolutely gritty pieces that we should be making. But that's a part of what we should be making. And I think what Jay's absolutely right in saying is it can be interpreted as that side of things rather than making great big strides forward in fantastically entertainment ambitious programmes, as well as the Exiles and Stones of the world that, of course, I love and we should keep making.
There are some tweets here that look ahead to things we're going to talk about in a moment, so I'll keep those for them. But Helen Nightingale says, Ben Stevenson's socks quite risky, but they totally work.
Yes, thank you. So, thank you very much. Julian Payne, who's the head of press, said that they didn't. So I'm going to tell you, I'm really, really happy now. You've made my day.
Just before we discuss the next two, I think these are really interesting choices, and they get away from the dichotomy that Joe was talking about, that risk is danger necessarily always. But just get a sense, either from tweets or in the old-fashioned speech way, whether do these four choices, do these feel generally risky to people here?
Yeah, I thought 7 days was clearly risky.
Okay.
And I thought that's the riskiest of the ones I've seen up there.
Okay, well, we're going to discuss that now. 7 days was your choice.
Yeah. I chose 7 days because I thought it was a wonderful example of just playing with the genre of taking observational documentary and taking it into somewhere different and challenging and interesting. And also, I chose it because, in ratings terms at least, it didn't work. And that's also got to be part of risk. You know, I mean, to return to what we were saying at the beginning about risk, you know, the kind of risk I am assessing, you only know if you've taken too much of a risk, if someone ends up in prison or beaten up or something like that. Same way, you have to allow for failure, you know, and any channel that's not having failures is not taking enough risks. You've got to have those things like 7 days that therefore demonstrate that that's a point at which commissioners, indies and controllers and so on went, oh God, this is a bit scary, but let's go for it. And they get it wrong, because you can't, you know, if you're getting it right all the time, you're just not pushing yourself hard enough.
I think that's a key point in all of this failure, and what we mean by failure, because I think we're all going to fail all the time. Hopefully we'll have more successes than failures, but the only way you're going to make standout, extraordinary pieces of television is by giving yourself up to fantastic talent, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And what matters in all of this is integrity. And if pieces have integrity, if they work or don't work, do you know what? You can stand by them. It's absolutely fine. And I think in all of this, integrity and ambition, for me, are the absolutely key things.
But I think we've got to get much better as an industry to talk about what failure means, because I still think, I'm sure there are suppliers in the room who say, yeah, yada, 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 and then my show tanks and I don't hear from you for 6 months. I mean, you know, we've got to get better at understanding that when things don't work, that should not be met by deafening silence. And actually, the interesting thing from my point of view about 7 days is, no, it didn't work particularly as a linear programme. As a piece of multi-platform activity, it's been one of the most extraordinary experiments we've ever been involved in, and from that will come other things. And I think regarding failure as something that will evolve into success is an incredibly important part of the conversation. conversation, and I think we all need to get much more mature about dealing with what things look like when they don't work.
You've been answering there a point which was made by Federico Gaggio. Isn't risk also about being prepared to fail? Is failure an option in primetime TV? There was that famous phrase in 1970s theatre and indeed TV, the right to fail, which was that if you had, and Dennis Potter benefited from it on many occasions, if you had something that didn't work, you were recommissioned. Is the right to fail still there, do you think, David?
Yeah, I mean, failure's an inevitability. It's just inevitable because there's no one yet born that's always right, and everything is a judgment, and things are going to fail. What we have to focus on and be kind of conscious of is the danger of a kind of middle way, which is which doesn't take television forward and doesn't actually take the medium forward. And we see it with genres that become tired, or patterns of tones of voice that become consistent in certain genre, or the way a reality competition is framed and the voiceover is written. And we can see it all the time on our screens. And it happens for kind of well-intentioned reasons, but it's usually because there's a fear of failure. And we delude ourselves into thinking we've found the way to make this work. And it's a dangerous course to take.
By a process of elimination, you will now guess that Ben Stevenson chose Desperate Housewives. Ben, why?
Well, like Jay, I was being a bit cheeky. And obviously, I wouldn't, if I was asked, I wouldn't just show that. As I say, I think that, there's the Exiles and Stolens and Shadowlines. But what I love about Desperate Housewives, and in any of you are interested in US TV, you've got to read a book, if you haven't, called Desperate Networks, which is about a period, I can't remember what it was, end of the 90s.
Yeah, it's by Bill Carter.
Yeah, it's an amazing book, which is about where ABC were. They were a failing channel. There hadn't been a nighttime soap for a long time. Mark Cherry had never written an hour's worth of television. He was a writer of Cheers who hadn't worked for a long time. And they picked up this pilot with a massively gay sensibility. How gay is it? It's got Sondheim lyrics in every single scene. And they commissioned it. And it was a huge hit. And it's because it was something completely different. It had a mixture of tones. It was a mystery, it was a soap, it was a comedy, it was emotional. It could have been the most hideous mix of terrible, terrible things. And of course, what happened the next year was millions of people trying to copy it. And they made terrible copycat shows, none of which worked. So for me, again, it's about originality. It's about shows that do something different. They can do something different in a gritty way that represents our life as you've never seen before. Or they can do something in a fantastically spontaneous, fun way like Desperate Housewives.
And that raises another question which we touched on before, but it's a question of where the risk is taken. If Desperate Housewives had been made by HBO, it wouldn't have been particularly risky.
It was turned down by HBO.
Yeah, but for it to be made by a mainstream network in America is therefore substantially risky.
It's a pretty sexually frank show. And those are the things you can never, Peter Fincham said it yesterday in his session, he said it's not about don't underestimate, it's don't overestimate. The audience are so smart. Never think, oh, they wouldn't like this. You've always got to be ambitious, because I believe that audiences are incredibly ambitious. I think they always want to come to things and go to a place they've not been before. They don't want to see something they've seen before. So that's what we've got to give them.
I've chosen 4, I'm sure, clips, which 2 of which are 2 of the most notorious programmes ever shown on British TV, and 2 which I think many people may not even remember that they ever happened, some of them. And they're supposed to we discussed some of these issues, but they raise different elements of risk. David, with your BBC Trust hat on, would you be happy if the BBC broadcast that programme or an equivalent?
I think as long as the programme was made within the guidelines, it would be fine.
I'll speak for Cheryl. She'd totally make that, because it's funny and intelligent with integrity, and it's got point and purpose to it.
Yeah, but the thing is that there has been a real shift, in my opinion, in the way that the guidelines are interpreted, and they are interpreted much more strictly, and there is a much strong, the lawyers and Ed Poll are much more strict about these things now, understandably after Queengate and all of those things. I mean, we made a film called Kids Behind Bars 10 years ago, and we filmed children in a secure unit in Bristol, and we were sitting down with the lawyer. We were talking about, we want to talk about this, what this kid's done. And the BBC lawyer said, well, that's actually illegal because it's against the Children Act to say what a child's done. But I think that it's in the spirit of the Children Act because it's in his best interest. Best interest of the child is the most important thing. So fine, go ahead. And we agreed at COM that we specified what he'd done, what he'd been sentenced to, all illegal, but he felt defensible. Kids Behind Bars, as it happens with the same title and in the same secure unit, recently went out on BBC Three, and I know that they had all sorts of problems with having to describe the children as, having been naughty, and they couldn't explain that they'd been let out on licence and then taken back in, because it is a much more cautious environment now at the BBC. It's all got very nervous because of the enormous criticism that's been hurled at the BBC, and the fact that if the BBC makes a mistake, then everyone jumps on top of it. If Channel 4 does something, if Kevin Sutcliffe says if he pisses off the Daily Mail, that's great, he's pleased, bring it on.
But even so, that's what I want to get at, is whether, because that is, the reason I chose that clearly is that it's commonly used by a lot of people as an example of TV going too far. Could you imagine it happening now, Jay, still?
Yeah, I absolutely could imagine that happening now. I mean, we just had quite an interesting and rather robust conversation with Chris Morris about Four Lions and the scheduling of that and how close it is to 9/11. And, I think at the end of the day, we should absolutely continue to push those boundaries.
And what was the outcome of this conversation?
Well, it's going out in the next week and a half or so. So it's not going out on 9/11 itself because we've got a lot of other programming, but it is around there because it speaks to that issue. And I think, well, fine, that's good.
Did he want it to go out on 9/11?
No, he felt strongly that it was an important flavour in the mix, and I think it is an important flavour in the mix. But, so is an extraordinary piece we've got called Bin Laden Shoot to Kill, which again is a groundbreaking piece of television. We've got some amazing documentaries as well. So I think as an overall season, you can accommodate a lot of those different things. But just to David's point, I think that's quite a comedic end to say, well, we could take a risk as long as it met the guidelines. I mean, one thing that is quite striking to me, having left the BBC, is it is a very different regime at Channel 4 and it's a very, very different approach. And I've just put that out there, I suppose.
Now, the reason I chose that was because the BBC tends to be criticised in this kind of forum for never taking any risks and having guidelines and being cautious. And it seemed to me that it's hard to deny that was a very brave programme to put out. Also, if we talk particularly to Jay about this first, because I chose it as an example, and this will get more and more common with social networking, where there's a huge groundswell against a programme going out before it's broadcast. But some of this is forgotten now because Griffin was largely humiliated on that programme, but an incredible number of newspapers and people were saying before this programme should never go out. So that is an example of the BBC holding its nerve, isn't it, Jay?
Yeah, absolutely was. And I was BBC One controller the day it went out, and I think Ben and I were both in a meeting on the 6th floor as we peered out the window and watched Television Centre being invaded. And I remember thinking it's not gone as well as it might have done, to be honest. And I even remember at one point people thinking, how are we going to get you out of the building? So, I think that's the sort of thing that you sit there and say that's exactly what the BBC should be doing. It took absolutely appropriate levels of risk on that. It was very, very clear why it was doing it. It was incredibly clear about the audience selection. To follow David's point, to be fair, it had gone through every single guideline. There was appropriate fairness applied. And, the most striking thing about that show, I don't know if you remember, it's a sort of statistic of shame, is 7 million people watched that Question Time with a disproportionate volume of young people, an audience notoriously difficult to get to current affairs programming. So it did quite an important thing. And I think that's absolutely right. It was a classic case of the BBC holding its nerve and a very proud moment, I think.
Although actually, David, which is another reason I chose it, I think a guideline was broken, wasn't it? Because he was treated unfairly. I think most people would agree he should have been treated unfairly, but nobody had ever been ganged up on in that way by the whole panel, the presenter, and the audience.
Well, I don't think that was any. I don't think we found. In fact, that programme never came to the BBC Trust. Interestingly,
that's interesting, yeah.
And I think it's important that the guidelines, the BBC guidelines, the guidelines that operate across all television, are for the broadcaster to interpret. They're not for the regulator, in the case of the trust over certain issues, the Ofcom, to predetermine how they should be represented. So, and it's important that it's that way around, isn't it? So I don't think the BBC Trust or the Ofcom have a point of view about whether a programme should or should not take place. I think the level of risk is a judgment call. It's an interpretation. And of course, Channel 4, as a broadcaster, interprets its guidelines, perhaps in a different way than the BBC in certain areas. In other areas, they interpret them in very similar ways.
Can I just ask quickly, does anyone here now believe that that edition of Question Time should not have gone out? No. That's, the reason I chose that is that officially almost nobody watched it because it got a very, very low audience figure on Channel 4. It's John Adams's and Peter Sellers' opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, the film version by Penny Wilcock. Now, the reason I chose that was that one of Jay's predecessors, Mark Thompson, at the time, who put that out, there was stuff in the newspapers, ratings disaster at Channel 4. This programme has got one of the lowest audience ever. And he said, which is quite interesting, who knows if he still believes it, he said, I don't care how many people watched it because it will have meant a lot to them, and it's the kind of thing Channel 4 should be doing. It also touched on this debate in a different way in that it actually was a very controversial opera. If you read Alex Ross's book, it's pretty clear it was banned in various parts of the American musical repertoire because it was seen as being anti-Israel. But that, all sorts of risk. It seemed to me one of the riskiest programmes for various reasons that's ever gone out, Brian, because it was risky politically, it was risky in terms of the audience it might get. It's risky to do modern opera on TV.
Yeah, but then you're giving it to Penny Wilcock, who's, brilliant. So,
but it never done that
You're
before.
mitigating it to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's a risky thing. Interesting that you say it's got a really low rating. I'd be interested to know, of this audience, could you put your hand up if you didn't know that Channel 4 had done The Death of Klinghoffer as an opera? Oh, okay. I'm surprised. I thought it was going to be very few.
Quite a lot of people didn't know,
I thought it was one of those things that made that people had heard about and knew of and knew it was something bold that Channel 4 had done, but obviously not.
I think the interesting thing about a piece like that is that it goes to the heart of the conversation about risk being loads of different things in loads of different ways. There's no way that at Channel 4 they're going, well, I think this is probably the new Big Brother. They knew that it was just a brilliant thing to do, and Penny Wilcock is a fantastic talent. We're making 10 hours of the most expensive Shakespeare ever made on British television next year. We are not expecting it to get big audiences. It's the right ambition for the BBC.
And also,
that's the right thing for us to do.
This week we've run Debbie Tucker Green's extraordinary drama Random, which features a woman standing on a stage giving a monologue talking about knife crime. To echo Mark's point, I don't care if anybody watched that. It got the most extraordinary reviews of people saying what a bold thing to have done, and I think that has to be part of what Channel 4 does.
Although, is it revealing? You see, this strikes me that in that case, the risk was taken by an opera house. In Debbie Tucker Green's case, the original risk was taken by the Royal Court. In Jerry Springer, the opera, the original risk was taken by the National Theatre. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that in a lot of the really controversial cases on TV, another art form has done it first.
I don't think Rowley Keating felt that the original risk had been taken when he was having people standing outside his house throwing paint at it.
No, but it's a bigger thing for the BBC to do. I accept that. But Nicholas Hytner got a bit of flack for doing it at the National. It does. I'm just talking about creative risk. I'm interested in how often.
But I think a creative risk that would fill the Royal Court is one thing. You're taking it to exponentially a completely different level when you say we're not just putting that on Sky Arts, to be blunt, and hoping 20,000 people might watch it. We're putting that on a terrestrial channel. And I think that there is implicit in that a huge ratings risk. And as Ben says, you don't do those things thinking this is going to be a slam dunk hit for us. You do them because they're important and because they're part of television innovating.